The French election may reflect the political trend for future EU elections as Marine Le Pen and Jean-Luc Mélenchon win big and President Macron faces diminished political power. Also, Congress has passed a bill that will empower the U.S. government to influence the political decisions of African independent nations through coercion. Joining us to discuss this and more, we have Dr. Gerald Horne. Dr. Horne is professor of history at the University of Houston in Texas. He's an author, historian, researcher, and his latest book is The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery and Jim Crow, and the Roots of U.S. Fascism. Dr. Horne, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
French President Emmanuel Macron is set to face a potentially tumultuous 5 years of deadlock after his alliance fell short of an absolute majority in a parliamentary runoff on Sunday, just weeks after he was reelected. Voters massively came out in support of the far-right National Rally and the left-wing coalition NUPES, depriving Macron of a ruling majority. Macron's ensemble coalition won 245 seats, down from 345 in the outgoing chamber, according to final results. NUPES, led by Jean-Luc Mélenchon, got 131 seats, while Le Pen's National Party rose sharply, and they're up to 89 seats. Dr. Horne, your thoughts?
Well, June 19th was a significant day for the global left. It's not only the French election, which I'll advert to momentarily, but also the election in Colombia, where the left triumphed in the third largest country in the hemisphere, the second largest Spanish-speaking country on planet Earth after Mexico, speaking of Colombia, with on the front page of the New York Times, the triumphant Vice President Francia Marquez appearing in all her glory in kente cloth, of all things, raising aloft the hand of President-elect Petro. This is obviously solid news for neighboring Venezuela. I sent a text to a friend immediately suggesting that Mr. Petro instantaneously get in touch with the security forces in Havana, because this victory for the left will not be greeted with equanimity, not least in Langley, Virginia. So to be warned is to be forearmed. But it was accompanied, as you suggested in your opening, by the remarkable triumph of the left in France. And not only Mr. Melanchon, a former Trotskyite, but an alliance including Greens, communists, socialists. In the first instance, it's good news for the French working class. They can sleep easier, not having to fret as much about the prospect that the vampires, speaking of Mr. Macron, will sneak into their kitties and into their bank accounts and loot them on behalf of the 1% by helping to raise the retirement age, by helping to weaken the world-class French healthcare system, which we in the United States can only dream about. With regard to foreign policy, too, I think it is something for Langley to worry about. Before this intervention in Ukraine, February 24th, 2022, we already knew that Mr. Macron himself had spoken of NATO as being brain dead. The French had pulled out of the military wing of NATO some years ago. There is a lingering and persistent anti-U.S. imperialist sentiment in France. It helps to influence not only the left, but also the right, because Madame Marine Le Pen of the former National Front, her party also did remarkably well. And given the fact that the major sectors of the French electorate, left, right, and center, all have a bone to pick with U.S. imperialism, does not necessarily bode well for this NATO intervention in the Ukraine, which was already on the ropes. That's the import of recent headlines. And I think it would also be worthwhile for your listeners not to necessarily draw parallels between the left in France and the Social Democrats of Olaf Scholz in Berlin and the Greens of his coalition which controls the foreign ministry in Berlin. Because Germany, because of the results of World War II and the persistence of U.S. military bases on their soil, is much more deeply influenced by U.S. imperialism than France is. And as I've suggested on these airways before, what you're going to see is a sort of tug of war for the soul of Germany between France on the one hand and U.S. imperialism on the other. And I think the odds are that France will prevail because, after all, France and Germany are the locomotive of the European Union, and both countries know that the Trump wing of the U.S. ruling class means ill for the European Union, meaning ill for Paris and Berlin. I think that this victory will also have knock-on effects in Italy, number 3 in the European Union. So it's a very significant win. It's something to celebrate, and I think it opens the door for even brighter vistas tomorrow.
So that sounds like the answer to the question I was going to pose. With Macron's relative majority, he now finds himself having to negotiate with Le Pen and Melanchon. Based upon his history, who do you think he turns to, and where do you think he gets the basis of the support he's going to need to get his agenda through?
Well, I guess I'm going to dial back my note of optimism that I just enunciated, because I think he's going to turn to Madame Le Pen. I think that his corporate backers will demand as much. His corporate backers are definitely afraid of the left. They're definitely afraid that the left will demand a bigger share of their super profits. Madame Le Pen will instead turn antagonism towards the African population and the Arab population, which is something that the 1% is quite comfortable with. And keep in mind that one of the reasons why the left did so well was, number one, only about half the voters turned out to the polls. However, a significant percentage of voters in Arab and African precincts turned out. That was good news for the left. It's not necessarily good news for the French ruling class, nor their puppet, speaking of Mr. Macron. Likewise, to dial back a bit what I said a moment or two ago, or to put it more diplomatically, to balance what I said a few moments ago, given what we already know about French imperialism being dependent on U.S. imperialism, there will be enormous pressure on France to collaborate with the Marine Le Pen forces and to turn its back on the left-wing forces, which are, as noted, heavily dependent upon African and Arab voters who have relatives and the like in the French neo-empire that resides in Africa. So if you balance my first two comments and synthesize those two threads, I think you'll come out with a reasonable analysis of what to expect from France.
Let me ask you this. What does this cause any fear or concern in other countries throughout Europe? Are some of these other leaders looking over their shoulders now, fearing similar outcomes in their countries?
Well, I think it's possible. As you know, Switzerland borders France remarkably. Switzerland, like Sweden, threw overboard its decades of neutrality in order to jump aboard the Ukraine train with the U.S. imperialism at the wheel. I think that perhaps there will be second or third thoughts in Western Switzerland, which abuts France, which, of course, in some ways is the heart of the Swiss economy. Now, with regard to Belgium as well, given the fact that there's a large French-speaking population in Belgium, the Walloon population, which is deeply influenced by France, if I were in Brussels, not speaking of NATO or the European Union, but the country of Belgium, I would be looking over my shoulder nervously. And similarly, with regard to London, the threat there is not so much an upsurge by the British left, but more so the fact that on the one hand, you have these forces in France, which will be reinforced in terms of their antagonism towards Boris Johnson's misrule in London. At the same time, given the fact that the left, and to an extent the right as well, and to an extent, as I said, the center as well, express reservations about NATO, this calls into question Boris Johnson's plan to keep a tie to Europe, not through the European Union, but through the U.S.-led NATO. So in some ways, this French election is going to overturn the table, so to speak. It's going to cause reevaluations in European capitals, but also in Langley and Washington.
There's a new bill that passed the House of Representatives reinvoking an old Russian boogeyman as a pretext for more U.S. intervention in Africa. Liberal Democrats voted for the Countering Malign Russian Influence Activities in Africa Act. It was a 415-9 vote, and this takes place in the historic shadow of the United States being involved in the assassination of Patrice Lumumba in the Congo, the overthrow of Nkrumah, and also the arrest of Nelson Mandela. It seems as though the imperial United States is back to its old machinations.
Well, you have a point there, and I'm afraid to say that the man who carried this legislation, Congressional Black Caucus leader Gregory Meeks of Southeast Queens, who happens to be the chairperson of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, is going to face a storm of protests in his district. I addressed his district, believe it or not, just a few days ago virtually, and already there are folks who are gearing up to begin with for a write-in campaign against Gregory Meeks for November because it's too late to manage a ballot challenge, and ultimately for a primary challenge going forward, and if necessary, a third-party challenge. So his constituents are upset, to put it mildly, about this, as well they should, because basically what this legislation portends is an attempt at recolonizing Africa. That is to say that to the extent that the North Atlantic countries manage to boycott Russian energy, they'll turn to African energy. To the extent that they manage to boycott Russian palladium, which is necessary for catalytic converters, which are part of the green economy insofar as they're installed on autos, they'll turn to South African palladium. To the extent that the North Atlantic countries boycott the Russian titanium necessary for jet planes, China just rolled out its Challenger to Airbus of Europe and Boeing of the United States, they'll turn to South African titanium. And we know, given what happened in 2011 with the NATO overthrow of Libya, Libya's Muammar Gaddafi, and installation of riotous anarchy in that North African country, up to and including the targeting of darker-skinned Libyans and migrants from due south, leading to the recrudescence of a kind of neo-slavery, we know that NATO does not have warm feelings for Africa. And so the fact that Gregory Meeks would turn his back on this history, thumb his nose at his constituents, thumb his nose at independent Africa, is an outrage. Not only that, but going forward, given the right-wing tendencies in the United States of America, as evidenced by the testimony of Judge Luttig at the January 6 hearings, where he suggested that the last fair presidential election in the United States for some time to come might have happened in November 2020, because the Republicans do not plan on losing another election and by means mostly foul will accomplish that goal. Their first victims will be us, darker-skinned people, black people. That's the history of the United States. And we'll have to turn to the international community, not least South Africa, not least some of these countries that Gregory Meeks has in the crosshairs. So I have to wonder if Gregory Meeks has lost his cotton-picking mind. I mean, is this a mental health legislation, which is part of the gun control bill, that's being pushed in the Senate right now? Do they have Gregory Meeks in mind? Because certainly I think that the evidence is suggestive that he's losing his marbles if he has not already.
Dr. Gerald Horne is professor of history at the University of Houston, Texas, an author and a historian. You're listening to The Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm your host, Garland Nixon, with my co-host, Dr.